around this brand and how its perception is on social media. And Andy, as I was listening to Jenny, as I was listening to Kevin, and as I did some research on my own, you can really truly say General Mills is that consumer staple brand. It has such a wide portfolio of so many different diverse products within the food and beverage space that you look at this and you say, hey, General Mills in a way is, diversified in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of reminds me of Pepsi in a lot of ways in terms of how much of the grocery store shelves this company owns. When we looked at LikeFolio into General Mills, it really wasn't surprising me, and Jenny hit on it really well. When we looked at purchase intent mentions, this includes pretty much all of General Mills products and brands in terms of people talking about buying those products. And you can see, as you'd expect, this is a consumer staple, pretty flat, somewhat cyclical on a yearly basis. But then you've got that enormous spike as people absolutely stuff their pantry full of cereals and carbs and anything that wouldn't go bad that they could get their hands on. And, it really has come back down to normal already. And so I think going into this earnings report tomorrow morning, I think that it's reasonable to think that General Mills will have a very good quarter. They'll have a good print. They'll have sold a lot of goods. But it will really be the outlook moving forward for the company that's going to be most in play. And I think the reality is that they probably pulled a lot of demand forward. There's probably, a few unopened soup cans and cereal boxes in the pantry of every American. And so I think that there's probably some threat of softness going into the next quarter, but it's really about the mix. It's about how much people are eating out versus at home. And so if you're a believer that people will continue to eat at home more than they did in the past, then General Mills is a pretty good play because 85% of their revenue comes from foods that are consumed inside of the home. And so they don't have that exposure as much to declining restaurant traffic, but they do have I think a little bit of concern in terms of how much of their, next quarter's revenue was already pulled into this quarter. They'll have to talk about that through the call, but like Kevin said, this is just a, consumer staple, all-American company that will always kind of be around.
Kevin, I'm not
Andy,
sure
I'm
if you have
sorry.
any
I'll
questions
take
on
that.
that.
I'm sorry, Alex. I apologize. I should have dived in there. That's my fault, Andy. But isn't it amazing? Your data really shows the spike, and then good news for General Mills. It's come back to where it was and didn't lose any ground. But as you can see, the price of the stock has rallied. But are you guys seeing? When I look at this data, it's hard not to make the divergence argument in some of these names because of where the stock is based on where the consumer purchase intent is. Are you guys, is that your guys' take on here? That based on the movement in the demand, but the movement in the stock, is there divergence here? Is that your take?
There's some. I think that you're kind of right in both of the statements that you just made. I mean, there's a big pullback, but it's a pullback kind of to normal levels. So that's really not that bad. It looks bad because the prior spike was so big, but it's a pullback back to sort of normal levels. And so that's a pretty good sign for General Mills. It wasn't just everybody had bought and now they aren't anymore in terms of our data. So I think that there's probably some room to the downside for the stock. I think that, if I were going to play it, I like your idea of the covered call strategy. I think they put up a good number. I think Wall Street's already expecting a good number, and so it's going to be tough for them to really rally on the news of their earnings. I think it's kind of a buy the rumor, maybe sell the news type of event. The company does have a history of disappointing. I think the last 8 quarters they've missed revenue numbers. I think this might be the first time they don't in quite a while, so that could be a relief. But this is a solid company that has a very loyal consumer base. It's one of those things you just get every time you go to the to the supermarket, you're going to get 18 General Mills products every single time you go, and that is not changing. So I think long term, this is a really nice company that's moving in the right direction. Kevin, like you said, with the organics and some of the acquisitions they've made have been fantastic. It's just maybe the stock's gotten a little bit ahead of itself, but that's really not saying much considering the stock rarely moves.
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of fool's gold then, Andy, with some of the spikes that we've seen. But in a way, it's almost, at least we're seeing that return to normal. And in a way, that's almost clarifying as to where things might go. My question to you is, I'm sure this is a trend you've seen in a lot of competitors, whether that be a Kellogg's or ConAgra brands or a Pepsi, as you mentioned, or other companies that you may be tracking. And relative performance, has it been fairly equal across the board that these trends have looked the same? And within General Mills, you mentioned some of the recent brands that were acquired. Is there more strength in some of those newer, more organic brands than some of the legacy brands, or is it just widespread growth, at least during that spike, across the board?
Pretty widespread, and I would caution people not to take too much away from what was going on during the pantry stuffing craze, because there's a lot of it was just whatever was on the shelf you would get, whether it was your favorite brand or not. And so I think people are returning back to normal. We'll have to wait a little bit longer to understand, if any of those favorites have changed as a result of new things that were tried during the pandemic and quarantine because they were out of your favorites. But in general, what we're seeing is pretty much across the board, all companies generally affected in the same manner.